It's hard, but
Good turnout.
it's still linear. It still makes
So we
sense.
just got our scores from the last test.
Right, there's a step process to it. But I'm having this.
Which, hey, I shoot for 82.
Yeah, I'm the same way. Well, the thing is, if you're like
I'm
always like
doing my very best.
shooting for an A,
Yeah, I'm
then
just working real
you have
hard.
to really screw up
It's getting easier now. My attitude's
to be so far off of where you thought you were going in. So if you study to where you're like, I believe I'm going to get an A going in, then you got a lot of fun, which is why I pushed so hard. And those scores were only stressful for me because when I walked, I felt lucky to get an 84 on those. When I walked out, I was like, oh, I actually failed those.
So were you kind of like you didn't know how you did when you left?
Oh yeah, like fully.
So I had to go and
Yeah, no, there were.
So I'm teaching myself.
Not on the ones. The ones that I got 84s on, actually nursing, I walked out and I was like, I feel pretty good about it. It's like, ooh, okay. I had a farm test. The pharmacology test was like, it's 50 questions, and I was, it's like process of elimination guessing on 15 of them, 20 of them. And I don't know, I just wasn't used to how she tests. That's the thing. Like, you guys have had enough tests. You're in the rhythm now of like, you know what an A&P test is going to look like when you go into it. You know what style of questions you're going to get asked, and so it should be better.
Understand what it does.
Yeah, the first, I feel like it takes me. I don't think there's a set standard for people, but it takes me like 2 tests before I'm like, okay, like I know what I'm going to get.
Yeah.
How it's going to be asked, so I know how to like figure out how to study it.
Yeah.
What angle I need to study it from. I think you guys, from what I've heard, like these have gotten more straightforward, and they're not as like words you don't understand.
Yes, we are, because we are getting to the vernacular. We are understanding the vernacular a little better. At least I am.
So I'm doing,
Speaking for myself.
in case anyone didn't get an email, I'm doing chapter 5 today. Sarah covered chapter 12 last night. That's all the review there's going to be on chapter 12 because your test opens Monday, from what I understand. Yeah. So I'll be around to answer questions about chapter 12. My personal take on the differences between chapter 12 and chapter 5 is that they are like, they couldn't be more black and white polar.
Yeah.
How you're going to study them. Chapter 5, and I stood up here last week and said the same thing, but chapter 5 is like almost straight memorization.
Yeah.
Of course, the questions won't be like ask, a blank with the definition and you're going to fill in the word. You're going to have to use your brain to think about what that is and what the question is describing. But I haven't. But if it looks anything like mine, it's going to be a scary thing. I was looking at electron microscope photography of viruses last night. That'll keep you up at night if you ever want to pull those up. If we don't think aliens exist, and start looking at viruses under an electron microscope, they exist.
Sounds actually very cool.
This was totally on my own time, too, just to help my mind slow down to get to sleep. I'm trying to catch up to Mary Ann, who's the patho teacher. 5 is like, it is, if you understand and you have every definition function memorized, like, as in, like, what purpose does it serve function, you're going to be really good on this chapter, for the most part. There isn't a lot of, like, how does this work type questions. 12 is put a ton of effort. Don't put all your effort. You need to know 5. You're going to have your tests are half and half. But 12 is going to be where it's going to hang you up on understanding it, and that's the one where in my labs and in here a few times I've said, like, if you understand function, the form will follow it, and it's easier to understand the function than it is to understand the form. So really, like, wrap your head around the process of an action potential, how they spread, everything that's going on in chapter 12. And, whether it's in a review or if you see me in the cafe or whatever, if you need to ask me a question about it, fire away. I will actually carry my notes and stuff for the next week because you will get me coming up off the top of my head. It's one that's going to require some review for me. So, that being said, let's start with 5. And I'm going to go into like my normal breakdown of like, how did I study this? How do I think it works? Just to give you a different look. Again, you can obviously you could write flashcards and study this chapter line by line and probably be good to go that way. But for me, there were a few like functional things in the way the notes were written that actually made it hard for me to wrap my head around it. The notes, there's so much information that it makes it difficult to kind of look at it as an outline and understand. So I had to like pull it out and make drawings, and we all know how much I love drawing in front of people. So it's a layer cake. This is like a huge chunk of skin I'm drawing here, okay? Epidermis, dermis, hypodermis. What's the other name that's given for the hypodermis? No. Subcutaneous tissue.
Oh, yes.
So the given name of your book is subcutaneous tissue. It's also AKA hypodermis. For some reason, hypodermis stuck with me because of hypodermic needle. We're going to be nurses. We're going to give a lot of injections. We're going to deal with a lot of needles. This was just how I remember the order. The epidermis, and this is where we just already saw some of the confusion that comes in with this chapter, is that the epidermis is like the top most superficial layer of the skin as a whole, but there's 5 layers inside the epidermis. Okay, so it's like something like, there's all these little layers here. So the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we spend a lot of time in this chapter breaking down those 5 layers. So that's where I'm going to kind of start putting the time in on this, and then we'll go from there. I have no way of understanding this. It's great. Like I've told some people, my brain, I just memorize letters in order, and that helps me. Other people have songs. I was last night trying to come up with a mnemonic that would work for how to remember this.
I've got one.
All right, please.
So it's starting from the most
superficial.
So it's can't let good skin burn.
Okay, perfect. Can't let good skin burn. I memorized it the other way, from deep to superficial, which was BSGLC. But can't let good skin burn. 5 layers. This one tells you where it's at. It's stratum no matter what. So easiest way to remember is know that stratum's there and drop that from your memory, because it's extraneous information you're going to have to try to hold on to when you memorize it. Simplify it down. So basale, basal, however you want to say the word, it's at the bottom. It's the base of your epidermis. What notes did I write on? I mean, it's important to know the epidermal ridges are formed there. They're not permanent. The dermal papilla are the permanent folds that increase surface area, provide friction. Those are the folds that are going to ultimately provide like fingerprints. And then know your cell types that are inside it. So there's a lot of new faces here, so sorry if I'm like going over some stuff. You've already seen my reviews. Like I just simplify things down and memorize it from there, and then I can memorize definitions. So the cells inside stratum basale is basal cells, Merkel cells, monocytes. You guys get how I kind of like build it, like funnel things down? It makes it easier for me to kind of study in small chunks. I'm going to stop there with function, like know what each of these cells does. But we'll move into that. That will be a different part of my own personal outline on how I study this. So, stratum spinosum. There's two key cells that are in here. This one's kind of like an easier one to remember. Sorry, every time that happens, it totally breaks my train of thought. I can't help it. It does it to me in class too. I'll like have half-written notes in my notes.
Will it be done by the end of the semester?
So these are still cells that are dividing. The cells of the stratum basale divide. That's the deepest layer. Those are your youngest, like, epidermal skin cells. They're going to push their daughter cells up into the stratum spinosum. So if you think about stratum basale, it's essentially just regenerating skin cells from up above it. So those, as I called them last week, mother cells, they're pushing their daughter cells up and out into the world. So in stratum spinosum, this is where you start getting keratinocytes, which are going to have your keratin, which is going to be it's going to be where you get your tougher layers of the epidermis. That's where they start being formed. So that's one of the cell types. The other one is one of my favorite words in A&D, Langerhans cells. These engulf foreign materials, so anything that like makes its way under the first couple layers in the epidermis, they're macrophages. They will take, like if pathogens make their way under the skin, they will take that, present it to white blood cells that can create antibodies to fight any infection that may come from that breach in security. Stratum granulosum. This is really where we start getting into, there's no cell division in this layer. When we really start getting into the amounts of keratin and keratohyalin that start flattening the cells out, creating tougher and tougher cells for protection. Okay. Just organizing it by what I need to remember is in that layer. Uh-oh, did we lose breakfast? Nope.
Not literally, it just fell off.
I'm sorry for you.
I just crumbs, I ate the whole weekend.
As long as my coffee doesn't spill, it's gonna be okay for all of us. Stratum lucidum. Everybody know what the term? Oh, sorry. See, I shortened my stuff even more. Everyone know what the word lucid means? Yeah, so
Understanding.
you can look up the formal definition, but like if someone's lucid, it means they're thinking clearly. So that term has always helped me kind of remember what this is. It's lucidum because it's a clear layer found in the palms of the hands and soles of the feet. This is where you get really large, flat, keratin-filled dead cells.
I think the granulosum, they're not cells, but all the other cells, all the other like spinal
So in granulosum, because cell division has stopped from this step to this step, it's the same cells that were here, but now they are the compounds are like their structure is changing, so they're no longer like living. They're becoming more dead cells. Like as you know, our skin sheds dead cells, so you're moving from living to dead cells that are there as like armor for the outside. And in here, this one, lucidum stands out because it's really like just the palms and soles of feet. So that's like that layer is not found everywhere in the epidermis. That layer is your one that is meant purely to provide a higher level of friction protection. We weren't the lucidum, yeah. And then stratum corneum. Corny rhymes with horny. It's known as the horny layer. This is your most superficial layer of the epidermis, and it is just layers of dead keratinized cells that are connected tightly by desmosomes. So, keys to know for me, 15 to 30 layers. Connected. The two key things about stratum corneum that hold on to and remember. This is where, like, your skin can do one of two things when it experiences a bunch of friction. It'll develop a callus to protect it from it, or it'll develop a blister. That happens at that layer. So that's why, like, if you ever go to, like, anyone ever get a big blister and you pop it and then it kind of, like, heals? That blister it can go even deeper through several layers of skin, but what you're seeing is like the fluid will build up in the blister and it'll separate the corneum from the lucidum or even deeper. But that's where a blister is really going to originate, is in that between those two layers. And then callus is the other protection. My hands are always super callous. I actually have to shave them a lot, like with a callus shaver. they'll get really thick, almost like quarter-inch deep calluses just from working with my hands a lot. I'm sure other people in here have either seen or experienced that. If you run around barefoot in the summer a lot, like your heels will get thick callus that's built up around them, and it's really kind of building up in that layer. So they're becoming extra thick. Know your facts that are listed in the notes here in the next section here about the stratum corneum. We're going to stay here and kind of talk about, we're not going to move right into the dermis. The notes do. I'm going to move into it, actually. This was my plan. So this all was in our epidermis. Change to red for the dermis. You hate red?
I can't see it.
All right.
Sorry.
I'll work with you. I had blue last week. That was nice.
Yeah.
But I didn't have anything today. Only 2 layers in the dermis, papillary and reticular. Is this organized enough for everybody, or should I rewrite?
No.
Okay. I admire Katie's ability to organize and block things out so much, but I'm not her, and I've tried. But I just can't. I tried all last semester to make my notes look like hers when she teach, and I couldn't do it.
It's just on top right. The most superficial and the most deep.
So the reticular layer is deep. I wrote them that way.
Okay, so I was assuming. I didn't want to assume.
No, that's good. It is in your notes as well. So if you forget that, leave it here. But you made me look twice because I was like, I think I wrote them because they're in that order. Papillary layer. Last week we talked about tissues. And we were talking about where do you find areolar connective tissue. And I was like, well, it's under the skin everywhere because it kind of binds the skin to layers below it, or epithelial tissue to layers below it. It's almost always under epithelial tissue. Well, skin's made mostly of, it's got a lot of epithelial tissues in it. So you're going to need areolar tissue to connect it to layers below it. So papillary is where you've got. That just died. We're going to red, folks. Sorry.
That's okay. Just write dark.
I'll do my best with what I'm given here. They're all dying.
I know.
So you've got, one of the key things for me to remember is you've got areolar tissue. This is where your capillaries, lymphatics, and sensory neurons are going to run through. Already bored somebody into leaving. Or did someone come in?
Just wait. I should.
I am writing as hard as I can. This thing's not keeping up.
That's
Sorry.
okay.
So it's got, that's where you have areolar tissue. You've also got capillaries, lymphatics, and sensory neurons. So one of those key sensory neurons is going to be connected to hair follicles, and that's why, like, even if just a single hair gets touched, that sensation, that's where your sensory, the neurons actually run through this layer of tissue. Yes. Oh my God, please, thank you.
I can't see that running.
It's already hard enough
Well,
to be
it's
up there
really
on my
not
own.
that dreaded.
Thank you, Nancy.
It should be dark. We're trying to help you.
All right, I'll keep moving just in case.
Bless you.
Thank you.
It's so hard to like stand up in front of a bunch of people you're technically in school with. Like, no one likes giving like oral presentations. I get to do it for like 3 hours every week.
It's okay, you'll be fine.
Thank you, you're doing awesome.
Thank
Your
you.
first semester. We think
Well, it
it's
just becomes distracting and frustrating from what I'm trying to think about when I'm like, I can't even read that. How's anyone getting anything out of it? So the reticular layer, the way I remember what's going on in the reticular layer is it's dense. So you've got dense irregular connective tissue in the reticular layer. There are other things going on. There's collagen and elastin there, which is what like makes your skin be able to bounce back. If you stretch your skin, I'm trying to stretch my face and I'm talking at the same time. It's not working great. If you stretch your skin, it'll bounce back into kind of where it normally sits. That's coming from the properties in your reticular layer. I remember reticular. I don't know, reticular sounds like regular and dense, irregular. It's not a great way to remember it, but anything you can do to kind of give yourself just that recall power of like, you hear the word, you immediately think of like what's going on in there. That's just kind of what I think about. So an important thing to know about the reticular layer, the dermis, all the cell types of your connective tissue proper are present. So all of your different cell types of connective tissue are present in different areas of the dermis. Depending on what area you're in, you'll have more or less of some of the others.
Just say that one more time.
All of the cell types of connective tissue are present somewhere in the dermis. That is like a little footnote that goes on in your notes, but I like I said, I don't know what's on your test, but for me, last semester that got brought up. I don't remember if it was on a test or somewhere else in class, but I just remember being like, wait, hold on, what? Where was that? And it was just a one-liner on the top of page 49 in the notes.
Okay.
All cell types of CT proper are present, which is connective tissue proper.
Yeah.
So,
In the dermis layer.
in the dermis layer. So you've got collagen and elastin in the dermis. Those are two key ones that get called out, fiber types. And then cleavage lines. You guys, I'm sure went over cleavage lines in class. Everyone understand that concept? When you go through a surgery, they're going to try to cut along cleavage lines in order to minimize the amount of scarring. If you cut across the cleavage lines, the fibers don't come back together as cleanly and nicely as if they cut along the cleavage lines. So it's like essentially cutting like along contour lines in the skin so that you can hide the seams.
Anybody in here ever get?
Yeah, I have.
So when you're
Soda
cutting,
pillow and home ec can make great.
good job. Anyway, when you're cutting against the grain of material, it's right. It's all messy and it's harder to sew together.
That's a good way to remember it.
This is how I understand it. So
Yeah.
if you're going with the grain of the material, you're not cutting against it, so it's easier to sew, it doesn't fray. So the cleavage lines in your body are similar to the grain of material.
You can see grain like in a baseball glove
Yeah.
or raw
Wood.
hide. You can see the grains of like animal cleavage lines a little more clearly than you can see it in human skin cleavage just on the body. But it's those lines, and they'll try to cut along those lines in order to have it come back together cleanly. If you've ever gotten a cut like up and down your arm versus across your arm, the one across your arm probably scarred a lot more prominently than something that would have gone. I should not do that up and down my wrist. On the on the back, like if you get a cut up and down your arm, it won't scar as prominently. And then subcutaneous tissue. Again, I memorize it as a hypodermis. For whatever reason, it'll click in my mind. I know right where it's at because hypo means below the dermis, so it's subcutaneous from there. This is where again, there's areolar connective tissue in the hypodermis as well. This is where your adipose tissue is going to exist in the skin. So has anyone ever gotten a cut deep enough that you've seen like little bits, chunks of fat sticking out of it? You guys didn't play rough enough as a kid. I got one of these like a week, I swear. That means you've cut actually through the layers. You've cut deep enough into the skin that if fat's jumping out, you're down into the hypodermis. This is where white blood cells are going to exist, is in this layer. The ones that stay out in the system, or they'll move out into this area, where they'll meet up with the Langerhans cells to find out what they need to fight off. And this is where kind of your first line of insulation, this adipose tissue provides you with insulation in that layer. Kind of locks in the heat. So, going back to what I've skipped. We good with the 3 layers of skin? Anyone have questions before I erase this and move on?
Sort of like the epidermal ridges and the dermal papilla.
Yes. So the epidermal ridges will fit into the dermal papillae. The dermal papillae kind of form those ridges first. They're there. The epidermal ridges will fit into them, and they keep the layers from shearing. One of the reasons that they're there. The projections will ultimately come up through and form fingerprints between those 2 layers interacting.
Form fingerprints?
Honestly, I need to recall now. The dermal papillae are the permanent ones. The epidermal ridges are not permanent, so those are going to be essentially your fingerprints, the epidermal ridges. Because the dermal papillae, that's why your fingerprints don't change over time, is because the dermal papillae are always under there. And so the epidermal ridges form over top of them, and those are going to be the layers that can wear off that aren't permanent. So if you ever worn a fingerprint off due to friction, you're using sandpaper or something, your fingerprint's kind of temporarily worn off, and then a few days later, a week later, you look and it's back. That's because you've worn off the epidermal ridges. But the stratum basale has regenerated cells on top and reform the epidermal ridges that are going to come up over it. Yeah, they sit. They kind of sit one on one and another. That I'm trying to find a way to make that click because I can tell it.
Yeah, it's not.
So
The papillary has nothing here. In the dermis, right? All like right there in the base of the epidermis.
don't want to answer that incorrectly. So let me look and see if something drops my memory here. So that's going on. This is the line. This is the dermis and epidermis coming together. Okay. So that is all happening right here,
Between the two.
and there's almost an interaction between the two layers here,
Right.
and the projections end up coming up through because so I drew these waves so that you can think like the ridges are happening down
The
here.
ridges are on the.
So your
dermis.
fingerprints ends up surfacing because these are all such thin layers that these end up surfacing up here. So that's where fingerprints are coming from, but it also does provide an interlocking between the dermis and the epidermis.
So where,
So
like,
the ridges are on the dermis. And the papillary is the dermis. I think we're getting where they are mixed up.
Well, the epidermal ridges are technically in the stratum basale.
Okay,
The dermal papillae
on the dermis.
technically top of the dermis.
But they mesh together.
The most, yes, they mesh together.
All right.
Does that click?
Yes.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Once in a while, there's one where I like struggle to. Did that make sense?
Yeah.
So the dermal papillae are on the very top layer of the dermis, top most superficial part of the dermis.
Right.
The epidermal ridges are part of the epidermis of the stratum basale.
Just like fits in, right?
Yes.
It's
Yeah, they just lock in. Because what would happen is that if you don't have them, you've got a lot of like dead tissue in here that doesn't. It's going to lose its bonds, and that's what it would just your epidermis would start to slide off in high friction in times of high friction. So those ridges provide a way to lock it in and keep it intact while the cells keratinize and bond together through the desmosomes. Went super nerdy there.
Awesome. We're all done.
Okay, so going back over it. These layers, these are the last two layers where cells are living. So as they're dying, they have to become more and more keratin filled. As they become keratin filled, that takes a little bit of time. If the ridges weren't there to support them and they experience friction, these cells that were transitioning from dying to being really keratinized and connected with the desmosomes that are bonding them, they would just slide off. If you're gripping onto something, you'd have skin cells like just sliding off if you didn't have these ridges in there. Does that make more sense now? Kind of how they're all working together? Yeah. So, hey, we pulled some physiology out of this chapter.
So the only two living cells are the basal and the spinosa.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Once you start moving into getting GL and C they're all going to be dead cells that are going to become more and more flat, tough, keratinized cells.
Then what is the keratin eyeline or whatever? Like what is it that causes them to become keratinized?
So they're going to differentiate as they move from here to here into the keratinocytes.
right?
So the keratinocytes they're the ones that will become, they're going to move into one of these two and become more and more keratinized because they started as keratinocytes.
So what's the difference between keratin and the keratin highlighter?
I need to double check. So keratin's the protein that fills the dead cells
Right?
and toughens them. Keratinohyaline is what actually dehydrates them. That's in our notes. It's a chemical that dehydrates them. It just leaves that protein in there. Okay. Did I?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'd focus on the hyaline part and try to remember that the hyaline is dehydrating the keratin. What gives the skin color?
Melanin.
What else? It's two. Melanin gives you the main pigment.
Is it keratin?
Carotene. Get it from carrots. Know those two. The darker the skin, is that if someone has very dark skin, do they have more or less melanin? What does melanin do for us? It protects what specifically from UV rays? So melanin protects our DNA from UV rays. If the DNA gets damaged, ultimately going to end up going down, that's where we're going to start getting skin cancers from because the DNA is going to get damaged by UV rays. The more fair-skinned you are, the more you need to worry about protecting your DNA from the sun's rays because it's more exposed. You don't have melanin giving you natural protection. Does that mean that very dark-skinned people cannot get sunburn? We're going to cover there on that. Actually,
Me,
yes,
is the question.
please.
Or what would supplements would a dark skinned individual need at the in Greenland?
At the what?
In Greenland.
What would a dark-skinned individual need in Greenland? They're going to need vitamin D because they don't convert vitamin. That's where I was going. What's the disadvantage to having a lot of melanin? The disadvantage to having a lot of melanin is that you will not convert vitamin D through the sun's rays as easily. So in Greenland in the winter, in Iceland in the winter, in the northern hemisphere in the winter where you're not getting a lot of sunlight, if you had very dark skin, you would probably need to supplement vitamin D or eat foods that are high in vitamin D so that you can keep up because what little sun you're getting, you wouldn't convert as much.
When you need to use
You can get it through the diet. The native peoples of Alaska and the very northwestern areas, Alaska, Kamchatka, Russia, those areas, the fish that they eat have historically been high in vitamin D until commercial fishing has damaged all that, changed things. So, yes, they got it through the dietary. Yes. So you're exposed to the sun, that activates the melanin, but that melanin does not become fully active for 10 days. So if I go out and get burned today, because I haven't seen the sun in 6 months, I've been in nursing school. If I go get burned today, that melanin that was activated by that point will be most active. It'll reach a peak after 10 days. And then it's going to decline unless I keep the sun exposure going. But it'll only be the amount that was activated that first time. That's why, like, a few days after a vacation where you've been out in the sun, you're actually, like, even darker than you were when you were on the beach. Because, like, it still continues to activate and surface from there.
I have another question.
Yes,
So you know how like in Russia,
this is way easier than going through the outlines, so keep asking questions.
in like Russia, they don't get a lot of sun.
Yes,
So if a darker person was there, they
Yes.
need more, like you said, supplements
mhm.
because they're not like taking it in as much. Is that?
It'll depend on dietary needs as well. So, Western Russia, Eastern Russia has a lot of dark people. I'm Russian, if you can't tell by my last name.
So is that what
There are a lot of dark people because there's a lot of transition from Mongolian people into Russia and back and forth as there's so much history in that area, but they've gone back and forth through those regions forever. Mongolian people are a lot darker than Western, more European Russian people. And so a lot of that, I'm sure there are genetic differences beyond melanin that create the darker skin in those regions, but dietary means are one of the ways that they're getting it. It's also further northern latitudes, so you'd have to get really far north. Kamchatka is like directly across the Bering Sea from Alaska, and so those people are going to look a lot more like native Alaskans, native tribes that have been in Alaska. So they are darker complected than I am, and is more like Western Russia, more Euro Russia. But they would have a diet that would be high in fish that's going to have vitamin D in it. So it depends on the region where they are. But then there's also like Siberian Russia, doesn't have that dietary means. It's also sparsely inhabited because people are not going to get nutrition. It has historically, before agriculture and things, it was a region where no one would inhabit because there wasn't enough. Like, people became very unhealthy when they went there. And that's why Russia used it as a prison for so long. They would just send people there because no one lived there and you were bound to suffer. So, turn this into world history as well. If it gives you something to tie it in
Yeah.
that makes it work, then that's all that really matters. And that was how I got through a lot of A&P, was like just relating concepts and tying things to other, like, okay, well, that's how that happens, but this is where it manifests and you see it happening somewhere else. So we covered skin pigments. We talked about vitamin D.
I guess just one
Yeah.
last question on the skin pigment. Down
Yes.
the bottom 47 said that like lighter skin versus darker skin, the lighter skin person will have melanocytes at the like basal layer in the spinosum, where darker skin people will have the granulosum.
Yes.
Can a melanocyte go even further than that and like you're really dark?
I don't know the answer. That's beyond my learning. You certainly won't be tested on whether it goes farther, or they will put it in the notes. But it's a really good question. I'd love to look into it. Now you have my interest peaked. Instead of looking at viruses, I'm going to try to find out how far.
I know there's like people that are like so dark that they're like blue, right?
Yeah.
Is that, yeah.
There's
I would-
subtypes of melanin,
Okay.
and one will give you a very, very darkest color, and one gives you a medium dark.
Okay.
What happens is that those subtypes of melanin are produced as needed. Genetically, they are going to be told, you're going to need a lot of ULN, melanin, and therefore you're going to make a very dark-skinned individual. So genetics plays a small factor in there because it's going to pre-map what type of melanin your melanocytes are going to make.
Perfect. And that would explain why you get people who have like so dark it's almost like a dark bluish tint, and you'll get like Asian is like a it's a darker melanin but with like a more of a yellowish type tint to the tone. Italians get like it's like olivey, almost like greenish brownish tint. So
So it's regional. and what you.
Well, it's genetic, as
Genetic.
Ed was explaining, like the genetic differences. And I would assume that comes from evolutionary needs for
For that
the amount of sun exposure and dietary things that they're getting in those
That makes
regions. And I have nothing to support that other than just supposing that has to, the genetics come from evolution. I'm not going to debate Darwin with anyone, sorry.
Oh, good.
I'm going to erase this. Let's take a 10-minute break so I can get something to drink and we can start over moving on into something else. Are the answers we gave you? Yeah. Okay, great.
But I think that's how a lot of the tests are done.
Messy.
Yeah.
Are you sick?
Yeah, well, I'm sitting in here, I wasn't, and that was
Yeah, don't you feel like a lot of either for one or other?
and I'm like,
Yeah. Like, you just have to
where
do
is
something like,
Well,
like, whatever, you know.
a good example is the
it's
questions she
too,
gave us.
it is.
Because you always have to go around.
sitting here.
Okay, could be A or C. Could be even D.
No, I have like,
Yeah, and that's.
So she's,
everybody takes me.
right.
I'm like, I'm not an artist, like,
One word of it.
but.
Way of the head. Yeah. And that's the best way to
I'm trying
help.
to, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, no problem.
I feel like I used it.
No problem. They say, use knowledge for consulting, that's the best thing.
I don't feel
No problem.
so I'm not.
How are things going for you?
Yeah,
Those phones memorized?
not fully, but we're almost there. My goal is to finish them up today.
I literally.
Yeah, exactly. How are you doing with it?
Not great.
Really?
We'll be done with
The
it.
phones?
I
Are...
focus so much on like this. Like
Oh, yeah.
it's like I don't
How'd you do on the last one?
I got 92, 46.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
I failed the midterm. So I need to step it up this weekend for sure.
Yeah. This midterm.
I'll tell you.
Make or break it, you know?
Exactly.
That's why people are so like, they're just gonna drop out.
And then she takes it.
We'll pass it, right?
Oh, yeah. That's not an option.
What are you going to pass?
A midterm.
Oh, yeah. It's in 4 weeks.
I know, but with so much other stuff, some of us didn't make the best use of the 4 weeks because we were busy trying to do well in the years.
Some of us had 3 weeks. They barely started the muscles this Monday. Yeah.
They want to go on notice.
Or us, I'm on Wednesday, but they're not gonna let us do anything with them on Wednesday.
Really?
Class, nope. So we're not gonna get that class.
Careful who you complain to around here, guys. That's all I'm gonna say.
I know you guys had it a lot worse. I'm not.
Didn't you have like one?
And there's resentment from the semesters ahead of you. I don't have it because I'm like, I don't know, guys, it's kind of balanced. Like, there's a lot of like pros and cons to the way it's set up now. But if anyone hears you in like second, third semester complaining that you don't have enough time or that it's too hard, some people might lose their mind.
It's not that it's too hard, it's just that some of it, I wish I had more time.
So,
I'm sure you wish
But,
the same thing.
There were definitely people who wish they had more time. But the encouragement that I will give you is that there were 154 people who passed it, who had 7 to 10 days to learn it. You can do it. You still have like more time than we had altogether.
154 out of,
I don't know exactly the numbers who passed that test.
because if it's out of 10,000, then.
No, I mean, I think our cohort was 197 to start. And then 154, my understanding, went on. So
Oh, you're talking about first semester.
No, it's okay.
last semester.
Copy.
I was saying that anyone, like, be careful if you're who you complain to, because I have personally heard people who are like angry about the amount of time you guys got because it would have boosted our grades so much if we had had more time on bones and muscles.
Oh, did you not have
We had some classes had 7 days.
To learn all
The longest to learn everything, bones, muscles.
What the heck?
Other
But
classes had 10.
in our defense, you guys had extra credit options.
It was 5 points.
Oh.
The test was like 95 points. So I didn't even study the extra credit because there were more points to give up on the test if I dedicated time to studying that instead of,
Okay.
And you guys don't even have to know the bones that we had to know. Yeah, you guys don't have to know the carpals either, so it's not like that got added to what you need to know.
Okay. Well, that's interesting because I thought it was a lot more extra credit than that.
No, our
I was
extra
like,
credit was
dang it.
our extra credit was the carpals. Yes, we got extra credit. There was extra credit 4 or 5 times through the semester, but we had more material that we had to cover. We had more exams and they were longer. Like our exams, some of them had over 100 questions. Like once you took in, here's 8 steps of a process, put them in order, and you don't get partial credit. Like so you have to answer every one of those 8 for that 1 point. It was and like I've told everybody in my cohort, in your defense, no one can say it's easier. It's different because you guys have a lab component. You have more time. You have to be here. It's not apples to apples.
And you guys didn't even have cadavers or anything, right? You just learned off of pictures.
No, we learned off of the models that are in the lab around the periphery, the leg, arm, all those buckets of bones.
Okay.
We learned off the same ones.
Yeah.
The real difference is that we have the syndavers for this semester for the muscles.
Yeah.
That's the
Do you
real.
feel like that would have helped?
I think it would have helped some people. I think it would have hurt others.
Because for me, if it was a picture and I had to label what was in the picture, I would do way better than like 3-dimensional. So it just like didn't. They're kind of 3-dimensional.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that would be very individual. So,
Interesting. Well, I found out yesterday how much those cadavers are.
Yeah, I did too. I know it's more.
Yeah. And pricey looks like anything in medicine is pricey. You get a
Actual cadavers are substantially less. They're like, I hear they're like $3,000 or $4,000 plus the dissection, so they're 6. But
I thought it was like 1,000.
is that why? Why we don't use actual cadavers? The syndavers are more accurate to what a human body would be working on a human body. Yeah.
My cadaver had uterine cancer.
Yeah, so like now it looks totally different than reality.
Yeah.
Also, cadavers get used for a long time. My understanding is they can get used for several years, 3-4 years. It is not going to be, if you tested on it year one, they dry out. The tissue is going to dry out and atrophy over time. So, it's not representative of reality because the gallbladder is now this big, where it's like the size of a golf ball in a human. So the SINDAVers are actually more accurate to, if you're working in the OR as a nurse, what you're going to see when they open someone up. So I think the argument for lifelike accuracy actually does go to the SINDAVers. Cadavers, our SINDAVers could use a little tightening. Like, I think the leg muscles are too loose. That's not, if you peel back the skin on a human, like the muscles don't just fall off to the side. So those need tightened up a little bit. But all in all, like, I'm pretty happy with them. Like I've told those of you who I'm in lab with, though, it's really hard for me because I learned on models. And so when the SINDAVer moves around, when I'm trying to identify things, I'm kind of like, oh, wait, where did that go? It doesn't look the same. So you will have a better understanding than I do of what a real muscle looks like on a human that size.
Don't you think this is going to be ever evolving? The anatomy part of it, I mean, not the bones and muscles, because the learning portion of it, this is the way we're learning it is not the way it is. Next year it might be a little different, and the next year it might be a little different.
No, the bones and muscles stay the same.
Right, but the way they present it, with teaching, like you guys were totally different one way, and we're totally different this year.
But we still,
next year.
so we were totally different. I don't want to get too far off track. We were only different in the presentation.
Right.
But you and I can both identify the most important things to identify the same way. So the SINDAVer is only a disadvantage for me when we start getting really deep. I start getting into like the deep muscles of the forearm on the SINDAVer, and honestly, I'm lost on the mannequin. So it's not, anyone who was in lab with me knows, like, I struggled. I stressed the forearm so much. And I eventually left my studying to, there's so many other things that could be points that I'm going to have to roll the dice and hope that, I asked how many questions are multiple choice on muscles, and I was like, okay, and I did some like math and figured out the probability was really low that I was going to have all of them be the forearm. So I don't know the forearm, the deep muscles of the forearm very well. So, and that's just, I don't know them well on the mannequin, so I'm definitely not going to know them well on the SINDAVer where they look a little different. In terms of like what we all are learning, I don't think it's, the human body hasn't changed, so we're all learning the same things. In essence. Yeah, how we're learning it, I don't think either. That's why I keep saying, I don't think there's an advantage or disadvantage. It's just different, but the end, we're all coming to the same end. It's really, I guess, we're really going to know because you guys will be the first ones that go on to pathophysiology after this, and the grades in there will show whether or not this worked.
What page are we?
Whether or not what
Starting on
was
the sternal.
I guess I wasn't reading the whole time. Okay, yes.